is visible to everyone. Chat में लिख दो यार. Okay, great. So I'm gonna pick up an HTML file for a website that I know we can go to, right? Let's just see what it looks like. This is our HTML, Hannah. It's very functional and it works, but it doesn't look good. This isn't what we see when we go on a professional website. This is where CSS comes into play. Let's go to the proper website and see what CSS does. See how it looks? It's very aesthetic, good looking. And in general, this is much more in line with what we can see. Like whenever we go to a proper website like Facebook, this is generally what we see, right? But today's session will focus on just CSS, nothing about functionality. And it's a very simple language, but if you try to master it and you really research into it, you can create some mind-blowing things, I'll tell you. Right, let me show you something. This is something that someone has created online. It's a progress bar, a 3D progress bar, and it's using just CSS. So here we can see all the source code that he's given us. But just look how amazing it looks. Right, you can just change colors, you can change the progress, and in general, it looks amazing. Right? Now that I've hopefully gotten you guys a little bit more excited about this session, let's see what we'll actually be working on today. By the end of this session, I want you all to be able to create something that looks like this. Okay, it's very simple, but if you'll notice, this is the same form that you guys created yesterday. I've only done like a minor change to the HTML, but it's the same exact form, right? Now, if we look at the code, this is it. This is what you guys did yesterday in yesterday's session, right? Yesterday's session कौन ने attend किया था? एक बार लिख दो. If there's anyone who hasn't attended it, then I'll need to explain a couple more things as we go along. तो chat box में एक बार लिख लो अगर किसी ने attend नहीं किया था कल का session. Okay, सब ने किया था. Great. So let's get started on basic CSS. Now forget everything about HTML. Let's see how. Okay, someone has written something in the chat box. Forget everything that we were talking about right now. Let's just focus on CSS for a minute. Right now, basic CSS has three major parts. There's a selector, there's a property, and there's a value of that property that we select. Okay. Now, the selector basically tells your CSS what part of the web page to target. The property is the property of that target that you're going to be changing, and the value, of course, is the value. Right? It's pretty self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and create a basic HTML page. Okay, great. And right now we just have a body tag, and that's great. That's fine. I'm going to be using an extension that's called Live Server, right? It's very simple to use. It's one of the extensions that are useful, that's very useful for VS Code. You can install it by going to extensions. Let's go over here, and there's going to be a simple button to install it. So what basically helps you do is just you don't have to focus on reloading the web page every time you change the CSS or the HTML. Right? Now, the way you can launch your live server is by just right-clicking the HTML file in the Explorer and then telling it that you want to open it with the live server. And it's going to open this for you. And this is the HTML that we've created. Okay, now there are three different ways of writing CSS in actuality. This is how you write proper CSS in a style sheet. but you can actually write CSS right here in the HTML, right? And the way we use the way we do that is by using the style attribute, right? So we just write style in the target element that we want to change the property of, right? And inside double quotes, we can just write whatever property we want to change. So we want to change the background to a black color. Okay, now this is a bit different from what I've shown you, but don't worry, this is the selector, of course. Like if we're writing it inside the body element, we don't need to tell our CSS that we're targeting the body element, right? And we're just telling it this property needs to be changed to this value, right? And as we can see, we get a black background. Simple. Any doubts so far? Any doubts? Okay, no doubts. Great. But as you know, HTML and CSS generally accomplish very different things, right? So we prefer to just separate them out. If someone tells you that, okay, you need to change the style of the body, then you don't want to exactly like just go into the HTML file, just search for where exactly, okay, in this case, the body is just right there. But if it's a huge HTML file, you don't want to just search through everything just to see where it is that you need to change your style tag, right? Something like this, if there's a style over here, it's going to be a hassle to change anything. So we don't use this. It's not the best practice by a long shot. The simpler way, another simple way of writing CSS is inside the head of our HTML. And that's by using the style tag. Okay, we do this. And inside it, we're going to write just the CSS just like I showed you over here. There's going to be a selector, a property, and a value. Okay, so right now we only have one element that we really want to target. Let's say, let's see body. So I'm just going to tell my CSS, we're targeting the body element. And inside the background of our body should be black. Or let's do blue. Okay, let's see what it looks like. And here we go, it's blue. But again, we want to separate our CSS and HTML as much as possible. So what we actually prefer to do is we use an external style sheet, right? If I delete this, basically just create a new file. I'll call it week and then just call it .css. This is now a style sheet. Right? And inside it, we can write our CSS. We can write body with the background purple. Okay, now while we've done this, there is no way for our HTML to know just yet that we have written a style that's meant for it. So how do we incorporate our external style sheet into our HTML file? We use the link tag. Right, it's a self-closing tag, so it's very simple. There's just two attributes you need to write down. One is this rel equals style sheet, and the other is the reference to your style sheet. So in this case, they're in the same folder. I just need to write week.css. And now we should see a purple background, which we do. Okay, everyone's clear on this? Any doubts? No doubts? Great. Great, great. Now let's move on to colors. Right now we're diving into web design for the first time. And the most important part of anything that you're designing is going to be the colors. So how do you write colors in CSS? So till now I had been using keywords, and there's over 140 keywords in CSS, but don't worry, there's no need to panic. You don't need to memorize all the keywords or anything. Those aren't the best way you can write the colors, but it's there and it's easy. If I'm, for example, teaching, everyone knows what gray is, right? And if I just show you guys, you're going to know that, okay, the code is working. But this isn't what we use. This isn't our preferred way of writing colors. So let's see what our preferred ways are. I'm going to discuss 4 ways right now. One, is a simple RGB. Now, everyone is familiar with these letters, this little short form, I'm guessing. R stands for our red, the G stands for our green, and the B stands for our blue, right? And we can give each of those a value from 0 to 255 inside the RGB function. And this is going to define what color we want. Okay, so let's just go for white. And white is just the maxed out R, G, and B. Actually, white isn't the best idea. Let me just show you guys the basic colors. This should give us red, right? And we see red. Now, let me just give you guys a bit of green. There's green. Sorry. And I'll show you guys the blue. There's blue. Okay, now there is a very different acronym that we can also use, and that is RGBA. And I'm not sure if any of you will be familiar with this term just yet, but this A stands for the alpha channel. Right now, what does that mean? That alpha channel basically decides the opacity of our color that we're going to be giving it. So this is black, right? And if I just give it an opacity of 1, we're going to see a completely black web page. But if we give it an opacity of, let's say, 0.4, we go back, we can see that the background, like we can see the default white still behind that black. And it's really useful to make images look good and everything. Right, so this is one main way that we can write our color, and the other main way that we use are hexadecimals. Right now, everyone knows what a hexadecimal number is. Just write in the chat box if you're unclear on what it is. I'll explain it. I'll just explain it anyways for the sake of the session. A hexadecimal number is a number written in the base of 16. So as you know, we all write numbers in decimal, right? And we have 10 digits from 0 to 9. Now a hexadecimal number system has these 9 numbers along with A all the way to F. These are all digits in this number system. Okay. And we can write our color in hexadecimal by just prefacing our hexadecimal with a hash. Right now, the CSS knows, okay, we're going to pass it a hexadecimal number, and through it, it's going to know what color we want. Right, let's pass it 000000. Right, much like the RGB, the first 2 digits are the red value, the next 2 digits are the green value, and the last 2 digits are the blue value. We can just easily verify it. Let's say F0, we see a red color over here, right? F0 over here, we see green, and lastly we see blue. We should see blue. Wait, I'm sorry, G is definitely not a digit, so here we go. Now, obviously, if we want to write down a color, we can just experiment with the RGB values, right? With the hexadecimal and everything. But it's not ideal for us to do that. So what we actually use is something called a color picker. Right now, we can see over here, there's a huge range of hues I can pick from in, for example, red. And I can change the color I want, say blue. And I can basically just preview what color I'll get. And over here, we get the hexadecimal code for that number, right? And this is really useful in design because design is more visual than anything. So using a color picker is really going to help you guys out a lot. Right, now let's move on to the most important part of design. In color, it's copying. Okay, Now what, let's say like I really like the color that Opera GX uses for its button, right? I want this color that it's using. There's actually a very simple way that we can, find out what this color is, and we're going to do it using Microsoft Paint. Okay, it's a very basic software. Everyone's laptop has it, I presume. You just screen snap a little bit, like whatever you want. You just take a screenshot of that. You open Paint, and you paste that in there. Okay, now what Paint has, it just has a color picker of its own. So basically you can just touch it, and there we go. We have that same color there. Now when we go to edit colors, boom, we get the red, green, and the blue values for whatever we want to copy, basically. Right. Any doubts so far? This is all pretty basic stuff, so I doubt anyone will be having any big doubts just yet. But just write clear in the chat if it's all fine. Inspect पे जाके, हाँ, we can inspect पे जाके भी देख सकते हैं. That's correct. That's nice. I'll tell you guys a lot about inspect element and how it's very useful a bit later on. But I don't think anyone has any issues, so let's move on. Right, now let's actually go over here and discuss a bit more about properties, right? Let's go over some of the more basic properties that every CSS developer needs to know about. Right, and let's start with the background. It's the part of the web page that obviously pops out to us the quickest. So we're going to discuss two things. We're going to discuss how to set which properties set the background color of a web page. And we're also going to discuss how we can set the image to a background in a web page. Okay. Now, firstly, very simple. The background color property is there to just set a solid color for our web page. Any element that we target, that its background is going to have a color of whatever color we specify right here. It's just write whatever we want. यहाँ पे as we can see, we get that color. Okay, great. Now let's discuss how to set an image to be the background of our web page. Right now, for that, it's a very simple property that we use. We just use the background image property, and inside of it, we write URL and we paste the URL of our image inside of it, inside just any quotes. Let me use a website that I really like for all of this. I really love Unsplash because over here you can just get really high quality images and they're all free. So let's go here. Let's just copy the image address. We'll paste it here. So this is the image that we wanted. There we go. Right. Any doubts so far? No. Okay. Now, obviously, this doesn't look great. Okay, we did want our this image as the background, and we got it, but it's repeating a lot, and that doesn't look very nice. So there's actually a property that we can change inside of here. And that's actually called background repeat. Repeat. And if we just say it, no, if we just tell our CSS that we do not want our image to keep repeating over and over, whatever resolution we've given it, it's gonna just paste that image in there, and the rest is gonna be whatever color the background is. Okay, and don't panic. Like until now, whenever I was setting the color of the web page, I was using this property. Right. So why was I using this property? This property is just a shorthand through which we can just use, through which we can set the image, the color, whatever we want. And it's just very easy to get our intended result using this property. So if in here paste the image. We still get the same result. So it's just a preference thing. It's like it doesn't matter much. Okay, any doubts in the background part? No doubts. Okay, great. You guys are doing amazing. Now that we've covered a bit about our background, let's just clear it for now. And let's move on to the second most important part of our web page. And the second most important part of our web page is obviously the text that we present on the web page. So let's just have a paragraph tag. And I'm going to use this neat little built-in feature through which we can get sample text from lorem ipsum. It's going to write lorem. And then the number over here just specifies how many numbers, how many words I actually want from that website. Okay, 1 second. Just 10, and boom, we have 10 words. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 from lorem ipsum. And it just acts as sample text. And it's easier than just writing down English on your own or even gibberish, because this actually looks a lot more like what English would look like on your web page. Okay. Now, if we want to style the text on our web page, we can divide the properties that we use into two broad categories. Okay, one is the font category and the other is going to be the text category. So the font category is going to affect the typeface of our text, the characters, how the L looks, how the O looks, just in specifically in this web page, how the characters look and everything. Everything regarding this will be set by the font part of the style. And we can set other properties to make it look good with our text, like how the alignment works, how the letters are spaced, how the words are spaced, right? So let's just go through some important properties of both of these. Right now, if we're discussing font, then obviously we need to be able to set the font to whatever we want. And how we do that is by choosing the font family. This is going to decide the typeface that we use, right? And let's just change it to something I really like monospace. Save it. And you can see how it looks different. Actually, let me just split screen this. Okay, if I remove this, you see how that changed? Let me just add it back in there. There we go. We just changed the style. I'm just going to completely change the font that we're using basically for our HTML web page. Right? Now, other than this, what if we want to use a different weight of font? Now, what do I mean when I say font weight? I mean that I want to set the thickness of lines used to draw these characters. Right now, 100 is going to be generally very thin, as you can see. 400 is about what we would expect for a normal just paragraph. And if we want to just use bold or further, we use like 800 or above. And you can see the text is bolded now. Right? And in addition, let's just discuss one final font property. And that's going to be, of course, our font size. And there's different ways of setting our font size. One, of course, is we can use pixels, right? And let's just set it to 25 pixels. And the way we just tell our CSS that we are telling it how many pixels big we want our font to be is by using the keywords px. Save that, and there we go. We get 25 pixels big font. Right? And there's actually 4 major methods we're going to discuss of how to set a font size. Right? What if we want to not just set a strong number, but we want to set an area, like a general area mein how big we want our font to be. So let's say the font size of the body is 25 pixels, right? And I want to set the font size in relation to what I've set it in the body. We can do this by using the M scale, basically. M is just the character M. There's no deeper meaning behind that. But what it does is it allows you to set the size in relation to its just nearest parent. So as we can see, the paragraph is directly inside the body, right? And if we want the paragraph to be just half as big as the text is in the body, we can write that. If we want the paragraph to be just the same size as the body, we can write this. And if we want it to be larger, we can write this. Okay. And if we want to compare it to the very root, let's just do this 1em. This is using just m. If you want to not compare, not like vary it based on what we've set in the body, but what we've set in the root, we use the root m. That's just rem. If I save this, you can see it's much smaller. It's basically the default. It's the default size that we use. All right. And as you can see, when our window is nice and big, all of that text fits in one line, and that's great. But if we just reduce it, it has to separate, it has to wrap, and it has to separate into multiple lines, which isn't very aesthetic. It's not very good looking, is it? So there's actually another tag that we can use, another scale that we can use, my bad. And through that scale, we can set the size of our characters in relation to how big our window is, right? And that scale is the VW scale. Now this is going to change the size of our characters based on how big our viewport's width is. Okay, so let's just save that. At full screen, it's pretty big, but you're going to see as I change the size of the window, the size of our text is also going to change accordingly. Right? It's getting bigger, and now it's just getting smaller, and it's just tiny. Right? But even this isn't completely ideal for a device that's really, really tall, because we don't want that text that's that small, now do we? So we can actually use the scale of Vmax. Right? Now what Vmax does is it sets the size in relation to whichever side of our screen is longer, basically. If we have a more tall screen, it's going to set the font in relation to that. And if you have a more wide screen, it's going to set the font in relation to that. Let's just save and see how it changes. Right, so it got a bit bigger because obviously it's a lot more taller than it is wide. So any doubts so far? Anyone? Okay, no doubts. Great. So we're done with the font side of our properties. Now let's move on to the text side. And we're again just going to discuss 3 simple properties. One, as I'm sure you guys will be expecting, is going to be the alignment of our text. And we can use the text alignment property to just align it to the left, which is default, as you can see. We can align it to the right, which just takes it all the way over to the right, leaving the space. Or we can just align it right at the center. Let me just decrease the font size so you guys can see better. Right, it's all the way to the right. And then we can use center. Now it's at the center of our viewport. If we just enlarge it, not quite centered, but we're going to talk a little bit more about everything. So don't worry too much. This is basically the 3 basic alignments that we can have. Let's just leave it as the default, right? and go on to letter spacing. Now this property is gonna basically just tell you how far apart you want your characters to be. It can be really useful in making your text just look a little bit more pretty or fancy. And you can see I've only increased the letter spacing to about 2 pixels, and it just looks very different. Like it's a very different style basically. Right, and similarly, even if if you just get rid of this letter spacing, we can adjust how far apart our words are using word spacing. Right, let's just have it be something ridiculous. There you go. Then that again is very useful in just making your text look different. And if you can make something look different, then you can basically make it look good. So any doubts so far? Should we use letter spacing or word spacing? Okay, so both of those properties accomplish very different things, right? In web design, there is no rule that you should increase the spacing between your letters or that you should increase the spacing between your words. Just experiment and see what looks good. If I do word spacing, what I'm going to get is going to be very different to what I'll get if I use letter spacing. Right? So these properties aren't exactly interchangeable. And what about font weight? Now, font weight, you can vary from 100 to 800 or whatever you want, but it's just basically sets how bold your characters look. If I set it to 100, you can see these characters are very thin. Right? They look like they've been written by like a fountain pen or something. If I change this to 800, boom, we get something that looks like it's been written by a marker. So you can again just vary it however you want and just see what looks good for you. In different situations, different font weights will look good. Any other doubts? Okay, I don't think there aren't any. Yeah, okay, great. So now that we've discussed the very basic properties that you're going to be needing to style your page, let's discuss a bit more about this part. Right, let's discuss a bit more about the selector part of our web page. We've seen properties, we've seen that we can set values to those properties, and we've seen how it affects our HTML. But let's dive deep into the selectors. So for it, let me just write down a bit more HTML. I have a div tag. Inside it, I have span. And this again is a great way to just realize how quickly you can write down a basic template for your web page just using these shortcuts that I've told you about. Right, so we have that. Increase the font size to something a bit more readable. Great. So let's get rid of these properties right now. Okay, so there's 3 types of basic selectors in CSS. Right, one is simply selecting a tag. Right, if we want to select the body, and we were saying that we want its background to be black, then in the selectors we can just simply write the name of the tag. Okay, if we want to select a paragraph tag, and just write P over here, and it's going to select all paragraph tags. And it's going to give them a background of black. Let me just make it blue so everything's a lot more readable. Okay, and here you can see everything all these 3 paragraph tags that I've written, they're blue. They have a blue background, right? So these are the most basic ways that you can go about selecting things on your web page. But a lot, like a way that's a lot more useful for us specifically is by using classes and IDs, right? And classes are generic names you can give to multiple things in your web page, and IDs are unique names that you can give elements in your web page. So let me just label this class to be blue. And we're going to have 2 paragraph tags that we want to be blue. We want these 2 to have a blue background. The way we accomplish that is we use a dot and then we write down the name of the class that we want to select. So right here we've written blue, and this is going to tell us that every single element that has the class of blue, that should get a blue background. As we can see, the first and the third one paragraph tags that do have the color blue get it. The class blue get the background color of blue, whereas the middle one is left out. Right? And let's do something with the middle one. Let's give it an ID. Now we want to select something on our web page that has a specific ID. We use a hash symbol. We use an octathor, followed by again the name of the ID. Right? We just say pink. We give it a background pink. And then again we have this. Right? Any doubts so far? These are the 3 basic selectors that you're going to have to know. So why give ID? So an ID is something that's very unique. So if you're going to give you so let's say you have something on your web page that you want to be unique, then you're going to want to give it an ID. Because if you just, let's say you build a web page where there's only one button, right? There's only one button and you say, I don't need an ID. I'll just say like every single button should have a pink background. That's going to work abhi ke liye. But as your HTML keeps growing, that's going to be a hassle to just keep up with. If you write down another button, that's again going to have that pink background that maybe you don't want over there. So it's best to be as specific as you can in CSS. And it's something we'll discuss further. But basically, the more specific something is to an element, the less chances there are of anything else using that. So we give this an ID of, let's say, button. It's the only button which has an ID of a button. We can just add multiple elements with, and we can just leave out. We don't give them this ID, and we can have a unique button among an army of buttons. Any other questions? ID and class difference when used by. Okay, so as you can see, classes and IDs have just one basic difference. Both of them are used to just target an element, but an ID can only be given to one specific element, right? And whereas a class is a more general term and it can be given to multiple elements. So we can have multiple elements with the class of blue, but we shouldn't ever write multiple elements with the ID of pink or anything. Can we divide into sections and then add color instead of ID? I'm having trouble understanding your question. Can you be a bit more specific? I'll try to answer the question that I've understood. So you could, but also then again, you have multiple sections. It's just better to use an ID, right? Because then like, you just run into the same problem with the selectors, right? And it's all about the selector. So the CSS is not going to look at your HTML and see how many sections you have or like how many of what tag you have. If anything in this selector matches something in your HTML, that's going to be changed. So there's workarounds, and of course, like specifically you can use different things, like different solutions for your own projects. But in general, it's better to use ID for anything unique. Okay, let me just close this. And let's move on to more complex selectors. So right now, what we've done is we've used a normal, just a tag, a class, or an ID to select our element. But sometimes it's not enough, right? What if I want every single paragraph that's inside of a div, right? I want that to have a specific color, a specific background color. Now, the way we do that is the initial tag, and then after a space, we write what tags inside of it we want to target. So this is going to tell us that, let me just erase this as well. This is going to tell our CSS that any paragraph tags that are inside of our of a div should be given a background of blue. Okay, and we have these two paragraphs that are inside of a div. So we should be seeing two blue paragraphs, and we do. Okay, now let me just add a paragraph outside and just fill it with some English. And what if I want the paragraph following a div, just right adjacent to this div, to have a special style? I can accomplish this by using the plus combinator. Now the plus is very important, and what it basically does is it tells our CSS that any paragraph tags directly after the div should be given the background of blue. Can we get this extreme last one? And how do we, let's just confirm that it's just the very next paragraph tag that we're targeting, and the way we're going to do that is we're just going to add another one. And this one is of course not directly adjacent to our div, so it's not going to get the same treatment. It's not going to be given the blue background. Okay, now let's move on to the second last combination that we're going to be looking at, and that is going to be the tilde combinator, right? Now, if we use this combinator, then any paragraph tags following our div are going to be given the style that we choose here. Any paragraph tags following our div will be given a blue background. Okay, and let's go here and we can see the second div, the second paragraph that was not being given a blue background now does have it. All right. And for the final one, it's going to be a greater than sign. And what the greater than sign specifies is, unlike just a space where all of the paragraph tags inside of the div were targeted, a greater than sign ensures that only direct children of our divs get this style applied to them. So we go to our HTML. There is one paragraph tag that's directly inside of a div, but this paragraph tag is inside of a span that's inside of a div. So we should be seeing our third paragraph tag be getting a blue background. If we go, third one is. Okay, right. Any doubts? Any doubts so far? No. All right. So let's move on to pseudo classes and pseudo elements. Now these sound scary, but they're really very simple. What pseudo classes are is we basically have a state that we can style, right? So we write down a pseudo class by having our selector, following that up with a colon, a single colon, and writing down the state on which we want that style to be applied. So we say that if someone is hovering over our div, we want to give the div a blue background. Right? It's pretty simple. You don't see anything, we don't see anything. And as soon as my cursor hovers over my div, we can see the entire div gets a blue background. And this is a really simple way of having your web page look a lot more interactive and just a lot more visually appealing. You just have these little effects everywhere. And they can look good, especially if you do better in terms of color scheming. All right. And let's do another simple pseudo class. We're going to have an input tag. Okay, we're going to have a text input tag. We're going to give it some placeholder text as well. Okay. Let's see how that looks. Right. Now, another pseudo class that we're going to discuss, very useful, is the focus pseudo class. What if the user is focused onto the element? And what do I mean by focus? I hover, nothing happens, but as soon as I click it, there we go. We get the blue background. Now this is what you mean by focus, and there's many properties that you can change over here that are going to make your web page look really nice. So let's get rid of this blue background. Okay. And this is how it looks. You see, as soon as I have this input tag under focus, there's an outline all around its border. Let's say we want to change the color of that. Now this is something you can only do using a pseudo class. We say when the input tag is in focus, we just don't want an outline. Okay, and there we go. We just don't get an outline. We can just set it to something else. Let's just have it be blue. Now when it's in focus, we're going to get a blue. I'm messing something up, I think. Color to be blue, and we should be getting, yeah, we get a blue outline. Now, as you can see, like with CSS, it's a lot about just experimenting on your own with different tags to see what works. And it's very simple, and I hope you guys try it like on your own a lot. Right? I highly encourage you to. So let's move on to pseudo elements. We've seen that we can set the input to have states on which it changes color. But what if there's a specific part of the input that we want to change? Right? What do we want to change? We want to style what this placeholder text looks like. Now we do this by using pseudo elements. Now pseudo elements specify a specific part, of our tag. Right? So as you can see, this first letter, first line, but we're going to be using the placeholder pseudo element because that's what we want to change. And we're going to give it a color say gray. It's already gray. Let me just give it pink. Color to be pink. You guys are gonna be able to see better. And there we go. We have a different color. Any doubts so far? No doubts. Okay, that's great. Now, as you guys can like clearly tell, CSS is very simple, but to create something that looks good is going to take practice, right? So don't be disheartened if you can't do it immediately. I'm going to like help you guys out with some courses and everything if you guys want. But let's move on to one of the more important aspects of CSS. Like it's actually a feature in Chrome that someone already talked about, and that's the inspect feature. Right, and we're going to discuss what everything is. But first of all, what the inspect feature does is it allows us to see all the styles applied to everything. Right, we select the input. These are all the styles that are applied to the input. Yeah, the auto or whatever. A lot of these are just default styles. Okay. And as someone else pointed out, yes, you can just check the RGB values for something by using its inspect element. But let me tell you guys the problem with doing that. Right, if we go to apple.com, let's inspect element. We get something that's a lot tougher to go through. Now, you can still do it very easily, of course, but both methods work. So just choose whichever one you're more comfortable with. Like over here, you're just gonna have to go through a lot of text to get to what you need, and that can take a little bit more time. Right? So let's discuss what this is. Right? And we're gonna be discussing something called the box model. Right? Everything that you write in CSS is represented as a box on our window over here. Right? And as you can see on the inspect element page, there's 4 parts of that box. There's the margin, there's the border, there's the padding, and there's the content itself. Now let's pick one of our paragraph tags. Let's pick this one with the ID of pink. Right? So I've selected the ID. Let's give it a margin of 5 pixels all around, some padding, 5 pixels all around, a border. We're just going to set the width of the border right now to be 5 pixels as well. And let's see what that looks like. So this is the paragraph tag that we changed. Inside this div, set the span, the ID of pink. So as we can see, this box model we can easily see on the left-hand side. If you guys focus, this is the margin of 5 pixels that I gave our content. This is the border. The border is 5 pixels solid. Okay. We're gonna go in depth on border and everything, so just don't stress out right now. This is the border that we'd set up. As you can see, it matches exactly to that gray line. This is the padding. Now this is the space between the border and our main content, right? And this is our content itself, the blue line. Now, of course, we can set the width of our content using the width property, right? And just say we want it to be 300 pixels wide. We go over here, we can see it's 300 pixels. But as you can see, the 300 pixels that we had specified are applied just to the content. Any padding we add, any border we add, any margin that we add, it's going to add on top of this 300 pixels that we've specified. So there's actually two main ways that we can have our width mean something else. Like there's two things that width can mean. It can either mean just this, the content, or it can incorporate all the padding, the border, the margin, everything, right? And it's very useful to do this, for example, in tables, where you have some table data that's taking up 100 pixels in its content, and it has a lot of padding, some border, and some margin. But you only want it to be taking 100 pixels in total, so that it just looks nice and clean inside of a grid. And the way we do that is by using the property called box sizing. Okay, and if we want everything to be included inside the 300 pixels that I've told our CSS, we say that we want a border box. Right? And what that does is, as you can see, our content is now only 280 pixels. Okay, because if you take into account all the padding, the border, the margin, that's going to end up giving you the 300 pixels that I had specified. Over here. Okay, any doubts? Any doubts? No. Okay, great. Now that we've discussed the box model, let's discuss a little bit more about this, right? The border. It's again a very important property. And we're going to discuss three main properties of our border. One's going to be the color. And over here, of course, we can just have whatever color we want. Black, blue, hexadecimal, RGB, as I showed you earlier. Another is going to be the border width. And this is just going to be how thick our border actually is. So if I say 5 pixels, our border is going to be 5 pixels wide. Right? Another one is the style of our border. As you guys must have seen, like I used solid in the style earlier. Right? And this should give me a solid border that's 5 pixels wide that has the color of blue. Let's see, here we have it. All right, if we inspect element, you can see, let me just select my id. Yeah, we have a border that's 5 pixels wide. All right, and again, there's definitely ways you can play with this. There's so many styles. There's this grooved style. It makes it look like everything inside of this border is inside of a groove. You can see this slight shadow. I don't know if you can pick it up on the screen share, but there's a slight difference in color over here. Right? You can have it be striped or yeah, dashed. My bad. It would be dashed. You get this. And again, for different situations, you might prefer different things, but they're there to play around with if you want to. But perhaps the best look, the property that like makes everything look the best and affects how your web page looks the most in regards to border is the border radius. Okay, and in the border radius, you can give it a value, a size, and this is going to set the size of the circle that's going to be drawn in on the borders. It's basically going to curve our border So as you can see, there's no longer a sharp line like there is outside of this. It's a curve, it's a rounded curve. And in general, these things can make your images and everything just look a lot more polished, a lot more good looking. Right? Any doubts? Can we round the edge inside? Rishabh, you're gonna have to like research about it. I haven't needed to, so I don't know just yet. But I'm sure there's gonna be ways. There's ways to accomplish everything in CSS basically. Right? Okay, no more doubts. So let me just move on. Like I'm sorry if I'm like rushing you guys, but we still have some things to cover. And there's not a lot of time left. So let's move on to specificity. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, CSS has the full form of cascading style sheets, right? And the reason cascading style sheets is called so is because of how the styles work, right? Now, different types of selecting an element is going to give it a different specificity. It's great. I didn't know this, but VS Code actually shows you what the specificity is. Now, the ID is the highest that you can go. Like it's the most specific way of selecting an element there is. So this number at the very left in specificity, this is if an ID selector is being used. The one in the middle is if a class is being used. And at the very end is going to be a tag. Okay, so let's just verify it really quick. We know we have a class. Let me just give this ID the class of blue. Right, and we dot blue it. Inside we just tell it, okay, the background should be, let's say, blue. Over here, we're going to change it back to the background being pink. And lastly, we're going to just target the p tag itself. We're going to give it the background of purple. Right now, all these three elements have different specificities, right? So as I told you guys, an ID is the most specific. So anything that has the ID of pink is going to have a pink background regardless of what we've written out other than that, right? The next most specific is the class selector, right? So anything with this class is going to be blue unless it has the ID of pink. And then finally we have this p tag. It's just a normal tag. It's going to be overridden by both the class and the ID. It's got a very sad life. And as we see a lot of colors. So let's just go into inspect element. I'd go inside the body and see this is a p tag, right? But it also has the class of blue. So as we can see, our CSS file tries to give it two different colors. One's purple and one's blue. And the specificity is how our page decides which color to actually apply. And as you can see, it rejected the purple because purple just wasn't specific enough. We were using a class and it preferred the class instead. Inside of the div, inside of the spanner, we see this. We see it tried to give it purple, rejected because the ID was there. Tried to give it blue, rejected because the ID was there. And then of course, if we don't have any class or ID, it's just gonna be purple. Right? Any doubts in terms of how specificity works? No doubts? Okay, great. Now let's move on to the last topic inside of CSS. It's very happy. We're almost done. But also, unfortunately, it's one of the most tough topics. So just pay attention for this one. Let me remove all the things inside of the body as well, so we can just concentrate on this topic. And the topic we're going to be doing is actually Flex and Flexbox. Now, the main idea behind Flexbox is to divide the space inside a container dynamically, right? It ensures that we're filling the space available to the container in an efficient manner. It's very flexible, as the name suggests, and it can help you immensely in creating responsive web pages, right? Now, let's say we have a container. Inside of it, we just have a button called hi. Let me create another button saying hey, final button saying hello. Okay, let's see how that looks. This is, of course, with zero CSS applied to it. Now, if we want to specify that we want to use this idea of Flexbox and we want it to be applied to our div, we change the display property for div. And we change it to two things, either flex, or we can also change it to inline flex. Inline flex and flex both work exactly how inline elements and block elements work in CSS. So inline flex is going to allow, let's say, an identical div over here to be able to be rendered on the same line if there's space. But if we just write flex over here, save that, over here, you can see these are in two different lines, right? Inline flex. And these are in one line all of a sudden. So let me remove the other div. And let's work with the flex box. We're going to say this is a flex box by the same things. Right? We have it here. Now, properties regarding Flexbox are divided, again, can be divided into two main groups, right? One is the property that's going to be applied to the container, and the other kind is the property that's going to be applied to these buttons, the children of the container, the contents of the container. Right, so let's just see some basic properties about Flex. So this is Flex direction. Let's start with container properties. And one of the best container, like one of the most useful container, one of the less useful, I'd say actually, container properties is Flex direction. Okay, now inside of a Flex box, there are two axes. There is a cross axis, and there's a cross axis, and there's a main axis. Now the main axis is going to be this row by default, but all the elements inside of this flexbox are going to be fit into this one row if possible. But you can change this to be column like this. I'm just writing this. And now all three of our elements should be in a column, like aligned in, just rendered in terms of a column. So they're going to be vertically aligned. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that. And here we can see. Right, and already we've done nothing, but you can see how responsive our little flexbox is. I decrease the size and it decreases along with it. It's great. Right, now the flex direction can also be reversed. So let's say we just put them back inside of a row. We can reverse the order in which the elements of this row are rendered. And we can do that by just specifying the direction to be row in reverse. Let's keep in mind it's hi, hey, hello. But as soon as I save it and it updates the page, it's going to be hello, hey, and hi. And of course, it's going to be aligned to the extreme right as well. And I can obviously set this to be column reverse as well. Again, hi, hey, hello, but hello is on top this time. Okay. So that's flex direction. But now let's come to the one of the better properties that are going to be very useful if you're going to be working with flexboxes. That's going to be the justify property. Right? The justify content property, what this does is all the content inside of the flexbox, we can decide how we want it to be spaced out or how we want it to look. So of course, there are basic, like we can render our content at the start of the flexbox and at the end of our flexbox. It's going to be extreme right. We can have it all be inside of the, like we can all have it all be like right at the center, right? And now we have special properties basically that make flexbox a lot more useful than just simple text alignment or something. And that's these three properties: space around, space between, or space evenly. Now, right now, as you can see, these three elements are just stuck together. They're either stuck together in the center of the page, in the left of the page, or at the extreme right of the page. But if we tell our flexbox that we want our content to be spaced around, they're no longer stuck to each other. Right? They all, let me just inspect element, go inside this, and we can see these buttons. They have a padding, they have a border, and everything is evenly spaced out. Pretty evenly spaced out, but not exactly. There's more space between hey and hello than there is between hello and the end. So if we want everything to be spaced evenly, then we just tell it to space evenly. And here we can see the space between hi and the left and hi and hey, it's the exact same. Okay, and if we want the hi button to be extremely at the left, hello button extremely at the right, we want them to give each other as much space as possible. Tell our flexbox to put space between them. Right? And this is what it does. Okay. And let's move on. We won't delve too deeply into flexboxes, but let's move on into properties for the children. Let's just move on to some basic properties. So all the children are buttons. Great. Makes my life easier. All right. Now, for children, they have some really useful properties. But for one of them, let me just give one of these buttons the ID of H. Right now, the flexbox is a flexible container, right? And one of the main reasons we prefer it is because it just gives us so many options to do things. So let's say I want this hey to be at the end of however many buttons we have. Okay, we are gonna style in our style sheet. What ID did I give it? We gave it the ID of H. We're just gonna order it. It's in 99. Right? Now the default value of this order is actually 0. Let me start off with that. And what it does is the default value is just where it's placed in the HTML. So it's not going to be moving behind, it's not going to be moving ahead. It's just there. And as you can see, it's going to be hi, then hey, then hello. But if I offset it by 1, it's going to be 1 element ahead of where it should be. So it's going to be hi, hey, yahan pe hota tha, now there's hello, and then there's hey. Right? Just add another button. FA. And actually, sorry, I misspoke. So the order actually sets a precedent. So the default value is 0, and with the value of 0, what you're going to do is it's going to be default, like wherever it is in the HTML. But if there is a higher order element in the middle, it's going to be placed at the very end. So if we give all the other buttons an order of 2, let's say, they're going to move ahead of our hey. Right? There's hi, there's hello, there's FA. It's a good thing I just checked that. But there we go. Get rid of this button. And let's start with another property that's going to make a huge difference again. And that is the property flex grow. Right? So if we have our content all spaced out, and it can be bigger than it actually is right now, then we're going to set a value that's going to specify how much bigger can it be. Right? And inside of this, we just have to give it some size, say 300 pixels for now. Do 300 pixels. Let's do 3, sorry, not pixels. And as you can see, this is taking up a huge amount of space, as much as is available to it. And these with 1 as a default flex grow are not going to grow at all. Right now, what flex grow does is this number is going to tell how much it grows in comparison to the other one. So if we just have the other buttons with the property set to 2, what we're going to see is these are still going to grow very clearly, but the element with the flex grow of 3 grew way more than these two. Right? And the default is they're just not going to grow at all. Even if you set it to 1, they're still going to grow. It's not as much. It's going to grow 3 times as big, and these aren't growing as much. So this is the main advantage of Flexbox. You see, it's using up all of the space that's available to it. It's doing it very efficiently. As I resize the page, even if I was on a mobile device, it's still looking really good to me. Right? Now, flex basis is actually the value where we give it some size, and this size is going to be the size that the element is going to be set to before all of the spacing happens. Before the space is distributed between all the 3 elements, the middle hey is going to be grown to 300 pixels. And we can see it's grown. We can inspect element. Right clicking somehow. Right, as we can see, it's 300 pixels. It shows us. And for one final property, it's nothing, it's just the shorthand. You can just use flex, this shorthand, and inside of it we can set properties. So inside of it we can just set the flex grow to be 3. It'll be growing 3 times as much as the other 2, which aren't growing at all. So let's just do this. Okay. And inside of it, you can again just set like flex grow, flex spaces. both of these, like all the properties that I've told you about. So any doubts with flex and flexbox? It's not a very easy topic to understand. I get it. But I'm done with vomiting theory on you guys now. So we're gonna see how I may, okay, no doubts. But I'm gonna tell you guys how I created the really good looking form over here using just the properties I've told you about, right? So I haven't used any other properties. All of my properties will be what I've told you about. And let's check out what I've written. Let me close these up. Go to D2. This is the index.html. It's the form. Someone messaged something. थोड़ा सा पेस्ट पढ़ा दो, slow लग रहा है. We're actually at the very last. We're at the very last thing. Don't worry. I won't go too in depth, but I'm just going to explain to you what all I've done. Right now, clearly this looks a lot better than just the HTML that I showed you guys at the beginning, right? That you guys learned how to make. And if we go to VS Code, we can see it's still the same HTML. Like I have an extra container over here. I've added some IDs, I'm sure, but it's still the same HTML. You guys know how you can make this, right? So let's start off. You guys probably don't need me to discuss what's happening with the background. I've just used solid colors. Let's start off with the font. All right. Now you can use all the built-in fonts, of course, but one of the main advantages of being in the day and age that we are in is that we can go to Google. We can choose our desired font. Okay, now through this, as you can see, we get a really clear example of what everything looks like. There's a huge amount of fonts over here, and I've choose the basic one, basically, the Roboto. Now, whenever you want to use a font from Google Fonts, you just select the style, and it's going to give you these two link tags, 2 or 3 link tags. You just copy these over into your HTML, just like I've done, right? And the best part is it even tells you how you should use it. It's of course using the Roboto font family, and in case it can't access the Roboto font family, it has this sans serif as its alternate. Now sans serif is obviously built in, but if there's any issues with Google, it's gonna use this built-in font instead of the Roboto that we want. So that's all fine. That's the font I've used. Now anyone can tell me how I've rounded the borders? We discussed this in the session. It's a very simple property. Just in the chat box, someone write. Anyone? Focus. No. That is not the property that I've used to round up the borders in my HTML. I've actually used the border. Yes, that's correct. Border radius. Use the border radius. Now we go to the form.css. Let me just go to my container. Right, and really good thing that I did this. So let me just tell you a couple easy ways you can write borders and margins. So in border or margins, everything that you write over here, like in border radius is going to be from the top left to the bottom left. And the order is going to be clockwise. So this is going to be the top left border radius, the top right bottom radius, the bottom right bottom radius, and the bottom left border radius. So as we can see, I have a container and I've left this square edge on top of the container, but below I've added a small border radius, right? And then above this container, of course, I have an H1. And in this H1, I've rounded up the top of the H1. As you can see, the bottom, the top left and the top right, but I've left the bottom to be again just squared with 0 pixels. Okay, now again, just a really neat little thing I did. Just in design, I find it's easier to have the color of your heading be the same color as the background of this next, whatever you have afterwards, to just make it look a bit better than if it, like it's just, it looks a bit better than if it was pure white, let's say, in my opinion. Right now, again, of course, I added these effects whenever I hover on top of any input field, I get this gray effect. Can anyone tell me how exactly I achieved this? What am I doing to have this? In my form. Hover. Yeah, that's correct. Anuta, that's correct completely. So I've used the hover property, and whenever I'm hovering over the input field, I've changed the background to this less opaque black color. Now, what happens if I do 0.4 in the alpha channel of an RGB? That's right, it just gives me a black that's not quite opaque, so I can still see the color behind it, right? But if I just left it there, it wouldn't look quite nice because, of course, like gray on gray isn't easy to read at all, right? So what I've done is when I'm hovering over an input field, I'm changing the color of the placeholder text to white. And I'm doing that just because it's just a lot easier to read and to make out whatever is written inside of these input fields. Okay. Now, of course, we have these things, but can anyone tell me what I've used to make the labels than they would be in the pure HTML? Actually, it's a fun little thing. Let's just have the HTML open. And title, the author, all of these are just normal in terms of how bold they are. But inside of my used a bold tag or a strong tag or anything, right? So how am I achieving just more bolder look that's slightly more pleasing? So I've used a font weight, and the font weight 400 is the normal font weight. That's gonna give you a more normal look. All right, and of course, all of this code is going to be available. Going to be given access. Encourage you guys to just use the index.html file in that I've provided you, and just style it on your own to create more good looking designs. Right? If you have any issues or any doubts, just I'll hear them now. Just tell me. I'll show you guys the page as well. If there's anything that I've done that you don't quite understand how I've accomplished, just tell me. Just... Okay, I don't think there's any doubts, but again, let me just do one final questioning for you guys. How have I? It was 1 second image. One last thing. So as I've just reduced the window size, the text inside of the input field has gotten smaller, right? So one last thing, how can you guys accomplish that? What have I done to basically accomplish this? Anyone? Vmax or VWS, right? Thank you, Girik. Okay, that's all from me, guys. It's been great to have you guys inside the session. If you have any doubts regarding anything that I've said, please feel free to contact me on WhatsApp. I'll write down my contact like number inside the chat box. I'll make sure that the code is available, the source code that I've written for that page is available to you guys, and you can, again, just any doubts you have, just hit me up. Thank you. Thank you. And you guys have been wonderful. It was a nice session. Thanks. Thank you, Girik.
Thank you, Hriday, for the session. I request everyone to now leave now. And if you have any other doubts, you can message on Discord and we'll try to answer your questions.